Is evolution a fact? Oftentimes scientists will say, evolution is a fact, it's not a theory. We have ample evidence that evolution has happened. Well, as a Christian who is skeptical of the evolutionary paradigm, do I think that evolution is a fact? Well, the answer is yes and no. Some types of evolution have indeed been established as a fact. This would be microbial evolution, microevolution, and speciation, whereas I believe other types of evolution, chemical evolution and macroevolution, have significant scientific problems associated with them and have not been established, in my view, as a fact. And it's interesting to me that the forms of evolution that have been established as a fact don't fundamentally represent a challenge to the Christian faith and the notion that God is creator, but actually look to be evidence for God's good design in nature. And the forms of evolution that are not established as a fact are actually those forms of evolution that do challenge the notion of God as creator. Again, chemical evolution and macroevolution. So, what are these different types of evolution that have been established as a fact? Well, the first type would be microbial evolution. This is where viruses, bacteria, single-celled eukaryotic organisms like the malaria parasite undergo evolutionary change, but typically what's happening is that these single-celled entities generate varieties or variants of the original form without really transforming bacteria from one species to another necessarily. So for example, the ability of bacteria to acquire resistance to antibiotics is an example of microbial evolution. This is a well-established fact, but is not a challenge or does not undermine the notion, again, that God is creator. This is easily explained by the fact that bacteria exist in such vast populations within nature that when they are exposed consistently to antibiotics, some of those bacterial species are going to, through very simple mutational changes, acquire the ability to resist that antibiotic. And if they can resist the antibiotic, that particular cell is going to increase in number within the population, eventually outcompeting those bacteria that are killed by the antibiotic. So this is not an idea or a concept that is, again, intrinsically challenging to the Christian faith, and this type of evolution is indeed a fact. But just because bacteria can acquire resistance to antibiotics doesn't mean that human beings necessarily evolved from an ape-like creature. The scale and the nature of this evolutionary change is very different than human evolution. Another type of evolutionary process that, again, is a fact and is not fundamentally challenging to the Christian faith would be microevolution. Common textbook examples would include the evolution of the peppered moth's wing color. In the United Kingdom, when the Industrial Revolution happened, this coated the landscape with ash and soot. And peppered moths, which exist in nature in both white-winged and black-winged varieties, experiencing this change in the environment, eventually, over time, the population of white-winged varieties disappeared and the population of dark-winged varieties increased, presumably because the dark-winged varieties avoided predation, whereas the white-winged varieties were much more susceptible to being consumed by birds. And so this is an example of variation within a species where the species is adapting to changes in the environment, but at the end of the day, it's still a peppered moth. It hasn't really undergone any kind of radical transformation. And interestingly enough, when the environment was cleaned up, when pollution controls were put in place, white-winged varieties began to reappear in nature because they no longer were inordinately susceptible to predation by birds and other organisms. Another example of microevolution that I believe can be considered a fact is found in the fossil record. And this is also an example that will show up in textbooks, and this is the evolution of the horse. From the fossil record, we know that horses appear on Earth, let's say roughly 50 million years ago, and the very first horses were about the size of a typical dog. They were relatively small in size, and their feet were different than the feet of a modern horse. Their feet looked like the feet of a dog, where there were four toes pointing forward, one toe pointing backward. But over time, the horses increased in size, and the hoof evolves, where you have essentially some of the toes diminishing or decreasing in size. They undergo what's called atrophy, and one toe becoming rather large, forming the hoof of the horse. Also, the teeth of the horse over time undergo a transformation as well, and this is due to change in the diet and what is available for the horse to eat as it is undergoing this evolutionary transformation. But when you look at the horse fossils, what you see is basically the horse getting larger, the structure of the foot being slightly altered, and the teeth anatomy being altered as well in response to change in the diet. These are microevolutionary changes that are not radically altering or transforming the horse in any way, shape, or form. And when you think about the fact that this is an evolutionary transformation that happened over the span of close to 50 million years, it's not a rather dramatic change whatsoever. And so this is an example of microevolution that we can document from the fossil record. And this is a radically different type of evolutionary transformation than a wolf-like creature undergoing the evolution undergoing an evolutionary process to generate a whale, where you have an animal that lives on the land undergoing a radical restructuring of its anatomy to be able to live in an aquatic environment. And so while people may talk about whale evolution and horse evolution as being examples of evolution, you're really looking at two radically different processes. One is a microevolutionary process that is not problematic to the Christian faith. The other represents the ability of evolution to create. And we'll talk in the future about why whale evolution is not as scientifically secure an idea as people commonly think. But again, the point here is that microevolution is not a problem for the Christian faith because evolution doesn't really have genuine creative power in this way, shape, or form. Another example of evolution that, again, I don't feel to be fundamentally problematic to the Christian faith is speciation, where one species can give rise to a closely related sister species. The textbook example of this are the Galapagos finches, Darwin's finches. And the idea here is that an ancestral finch made its way to the Galapagos Islands from South America, and once on the Galapagos Islands underwent diversification to generate a variety of different finch species that vary in size and vary in beak shape and in beak size. Again, this is not ascribing creative power or potential to the evolutionary process. It's essentially microevolutionary mechanisms that have been extended to populations that have become isolated on the different islands of the Galapagos. And as a consequence of that, in that isolation, the microevolutionary changes in the population become different, become distinct, creating organisms that appear superficially to be different from each other, but still represent finches. There's no radical evolution happening, no radical transformation happening. And in fact, many of these finch species, when you bring them together, can actually reproduce and generate viable offspring, really raising questions as to whether or not they are distinct species or in fact may actually be varieties of the same species. So the whole point here is that when scientists say that evolution is a fact, there's some validity to that because we do have ample evidence this evidence is presented in textbooks for microbial evolution, for microevolution, and for speciation. But just because we have evidence for evolution happening at these three levels doesn't mean that we have evidence that life evolved from non-life, abiogenesis or chemical evolution, or that a wolf-like creature evolved to a whale, or an ape-like creature evolved to give rise to humans. These are different evolutionary processes than microbial evolution, microevolution, and speciation. Now, I actually think of these three different processes that, again, I believe are established by scientific observation and evidence as actually being part of God's good design. And the way I think about these types of processes is that this represents what scientists would call a feedback mechanism. And all of you are familiar with how feedback mechanisms work if you've ever used a thermostat. All right, a thermostat